So, you're in an enclosed room, let's say 12 by 12, 15 by 15, enclosed room, no windows. And you're having a seance, and you're all holding hands at the table. You know, not the hold hand trick, but the old hold the wrist trick. So hands are free for the madam to do her thing. Oh, you know? So you're all in that enclosed room, and the madam is looking into her crystal ball. And it's all foggy or something. So, and all you can't see anything. It's totally 100% dark in this room. This doesn't snow very well. Oh, it looks good on camera though. But, so you've got all these people in an enclosed room. No windows. No light. You're having a seance. And this is in like little under 1895, 96, around there. And someone gets murdered. Now, no doors opened. There are no windows. Who did it? Well, welcome to the D. Louise series. My name is Christina, Krstna. This is where we read books and talk about books. No special effects going on here. What you see is what you get. The old Roots Web thing. Come here. Come here. Come here. Come say hi. Hi. So you check out my If My Cats Could Talk videos. Those are so cute. And it's nice to meet you. I'm trying to learn sign language for substituting teaching. But anyways, because one of the characters in this series is deaf. So I'm trying to learn a little bit, and he's so cute. It's Victoria Thompson, Murder on Waverly Place. This is book 11 in the series. We're reading them all. We're going through them all. We're binge reading them all. And be prepared for spoilers, 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 lots and lots of spoilers. Because the video aired this week. The John Sanford one aired this week. And that's the one that started all the trouble. Or could be good trouble. But you'll have to check out those videos. Someone thanks me for spoiling. I have over 700 videos. I'm almost to 800 videos. They're all spoilers because I like to talk about the books and I like to share the books with you. I like to read. And would you believe it or not, I believe this is 97 or 98 for the year. So, check it out. You're in a room. It's locked. Well, not locked, but there's no windows. There's 6 of you in the room. Who did it? Shall we find out? And do you think there was a secret door? Do you think there was a secret closet? You know, like in the White House where it looks, there's no doorknob, but the door is there, but it's made to look like there's no door there. Let's see. So Sarah comes home. Oh, Sarah Brandt is a midwife. She's regaining or re-engaging with her parents after a difficult past, and some of that is brought up in this book. That's why we'll talk about just a little bit. Sarah's sister married a clerk, and her parents did not approve, and her parents kicked them out and made them live on the streets in hopes that they would swallow their pride and come back and ask for forgiveness. But their pride would not allow it, and they ended up dying. The daughter died in childbirth, and then the husband died of guilt thereafter. He hung himself, I think. So Sarah's parents tried to learn their lesson when Sarah married Dr. Brandt, we've never learned how they met, so, or at least I don't remember how they met. But Sarah was also estranged from her parents over the whole situation. And that's why she became a midwife. She took over her husband's practice after he got murdered. And we did solve that in the last book. We finally solved it in book 10. Because we had talked about it for 10 books. We finally solved it, and let's put it aside now. So now Sarah's relationship with her parents is much, much better. She's seeing them much, much often. She's also adopted Catherine from a mission, and she hired Maeve from the mission to take care of Catherine while she was out midwifing, and they've become a family unit. And we also have Mrs. Ellsworth, the neighbor, and Nelson, her son, was involved in a couple of books back. We haven't seen him in a while, but he will become a major player later on in the book series. And we will do a lot. Mrs. Ellsworth has become the permanent grandma. I know Mrs. Decker is grandma too, sort of, but Mrs. Ellsworth is there every day. She's teaching the girls how to clean, how to cook, how to bake, and they're just having fun learning from Mrs. Ellsworth. She's doing a really good job. And then because we have Frank, the detective sergeant with the police department, and he just finished all this up, and Roosevelt has just been promoted to Secretary of the Navy. So he's no longer commissioner. We're going to have to see how the police force adjusts after he left, because before he got there, it was very, very corrupted. He wasn't there too long. He was trying to straighten out some things. Let's see if it gets back to corruption or not. Yes, ma'am. You rang? Okay. So, Sarah comes home from her evening of midwifery. Frank has a boy, Brian, that's deaf, but we don't see or hear from him, and we don't see or hear from his mother the whole book. So Sarah comes home from her midwifery, and Elizabeth Decker is there hanging out with the kids. And after they spend some quality time with the kids, and her mother confesses she thinks my mother's here for an alternative reason. She would have spent all of this time if she didn't have an alternative reason. She wants Sarah to go to a seance with her because Elizabeth wants to contact the spirit of her daughter Maggie and ask Maggie for forgiveness. And so after her mother leaves, Sarah talks to Maeve. Maeve is going to become more and more important in the series as the series goes on. Recently, Sarah had learned that in her former life, Maeve had been a grifter, or at least that she'd come from a family of grifters, people who made their living by conning people in elaborate shames. Although Maeve had never given Sarah any reason to suspect she was dishonest, Sarah's friend, Detective Sergeant Frank Malloy, had recognized her abilities immediately when Maeve had employed them to help him solve the murder of Sarah's husband, Dr. Tom Brandt. I never knew anybody who did that kind of thing, Maeve replied. You need a house in a respectable neighborhood, and most of all, you need some way to get people with money to come to you. You know, classy people who can vouch for you. My family never could have managed the house part of it. But you know that it's all fake, don't you? I figured it out. It was. People talk, so I heard about it. There's a lot of money in it. How do they get money from people? Not by stealing or anything, Maeve hastened to assure her. The customers. They come back of their own free will. The trick is to make them want to. You tell them some little thing the first time, just enough to make them believe it's on the up and up. Then you have them come back to hear more. Next time you'll tell them a little bit more and promise the next time there'll be even more. There's no end to it, and they'll pay more and more each time to hear what they think the spirits are telling them. Sarah sighed. That's what I was afraid of. And she thinks her mother is being conned, and she is. So Sarah goes to the seance, and they are greeted by the professor, who pretends he's like a butler, sort of, kind of, who pretends to give Mrs. Decker grief about bringing a guest. He wasn't informed that there was going to be a guest at this seance. And then they meet Kathy Burke, the lady that told Sarah's mom about the seance, and it's word of mouth. Hey, look, I went to this thing and I was able to communicate with so and so. You need to come. And Sarah's mom got it in her head that she wanted to talk to Maggie. So that's why she's coming, but Mrs. Decker didn't want to come alone. And so they meet Mrs. Burke and John Sharp, Mrs. Giddings, Mr. Cunningham, and Sarafina. And Sarafina has her spirit guide, Yellow Fever. And Sarafina gives her seance speech. Before we begin, we will hold the hands of the person on either side. This creates a bond between us and makes it easier for the spirits to communicate with us. Then I will turn out the light and close the door. The room will be very dark. When I have taken my seat again, I will call on my spirit guide, Yellow Feather. He was an Indian warrior who died in battle many years ago, and he is the one who actually speaks to the spirits, not I. In fact, he speaks through me. If he chooses to appear today, he will actually take over my body. You will know because you will hear his voice and not mine when I speak. If any of the spirits have a message for someone here, they will convey it to Yellow Feather. And it's the total major con, major huge con. So Sarafina and her crew give enough crumbs that they believe it's true. And they pick up little tidbits from conversations. And someone told them, probably Mrs. Burke had told Mrs. Giddings or Sarafina about Mrs. Decker's lost daughter. So they brought it up, and they had a baby cry, and automatically Mrs. Decker hears the baby cry and thinks it's Maggie's child and spews tons of information, gives them tons of information to use against her in further seance settings, gives them all this little stuff so that they can feed her little tidbits, just generalizations that could be for anybody and anything. And so they buy it. Most of the marks buy it because they want to believe so desperately. Then they do the seance and they leave. And Mrs. Decker believes it was real. She bought into it. She was conned, but Sarah doesn't. And when she gets home, there's the big announcement about Roosevelt. What? Oh yes, I brought. Mrs. Ellsworth says, "Oh yes, I brought it over for you to see. I don't suppose you've heard the news yet," she added with a frown. "What news? About Mr. Roosevelt?" "Oh dear." Sarah, reaching for the paper, she unfolded it to reveal the headline, "Roosevelt Resigns." She quickly scanned the story. Her old friend Theodore Roosevelt had resigned as police commissioner to accept a job in Washington, D.C., just as my father predicted. "Your father knew that President McKinley was going to offer him a position in Washington?" Mrs. Ellsworth asked in amazement. "I'm sure he didn't know exactly what it would be, but politicians always pay their debts, and Mr. Roosevelt campaigned very vigorously for McKinley. The president will be giving out hundreds of political patronage jobs to supporters to reward them." "Assistant Secretary of the Navy doesn't sound like a very important job," Mrs. Ellsworth observed. "I'm sure Theodore Roosevelt will make the most of it," Sarah said. "But it probably isn't good news for the police department." What do you mean?" "Mr. Roosevelt made a lot of changes in the department. He hired men on merit instead of political patronage. He promoted men who were good at their jobs instead of those who could afford to pay a bribe to get a better position. He even hired officers who weren't Irish. But surely they won't go back to the way things were before because Roosevelt leaves." "Mr. Malloy is afraid they will," Sarah said. "That's why he was in such a hurry to solve Tom's murder. He knew Roosevelt was going to resign soon, and then he might not be allowed to work on the case anymore." "Oh my," Mrs. Ellsworth said. "Is he afraid he'll lose his job?" Sarah knew that was a possibility. Roosevelt had singled Malloy out several times to work on cases involving wealthy murder victims. Some in the department would be envious of the special treatment, and they would hold it against him. So we'll see what happens with that. Later that night, Maeve and Sarah talk about the seance. The next day, Mrs. Decker comes over with a book for Catherine, and while they there, uh, Mrs. Decker had left and went to the seance. The next day, the Officer Donatelli arrives at her door to inform Sarah that there's been a murder at the seance and that her mother was there. So Mrs. Decker had told them to get Frank Malloy to this investigation, and Frank sent Donatelli to get Sarah. Now, we're told that first, and then the next chapter is like a flashback, because in the next couple chapters, Donatelli hasn't even left yet. Frank Malloy hasn't seen Sarah at a murder scene for a while, and now all of a sudden she was summoning him. But when he gets there, it's not Sarah, but Mrs. Decker. And she says to him, now remember, they were in a locked room. I couldn't give the police my real name, Mrs. Decker explained to him the moment they were alone. He immediately taken her to what appeared to be some sort of office to interrogate her in private. Do you know what the newspapers would do if they found out I was present at a murder? Nobody would think twice about your daughter being at one, Frank said with a weary sigh. Exactly, Mrs. Decker gave an approving smile. She's already been here with me the first time I came. Why was Frank not surprised? Tell me what happened. We were having a seance in that room where the body, he supplied when she couldn't bring herself to say it. Yes, where the body is. We were seated around the round table holding hands. Holding hands? He echoed in surprise. He had seen the room with the table where the body was, but nobody had mentioned holding hands. Yes, it increases the bond to help the spirits communicate with us. Maybe we should sit down. And she tells him the story. And then while he's there, he talks to Professor Rogers and Sarafina and Mrs. Burke and Mrs. Giddings, Mr. Sharp, Mr. Cunningham. Now these are your suspects, all the people in the room. But there may be another suspect too. There may have been somebody in the closet. So they catch the boy, and it turns out he is Sarafina's fiance, but they can't be public about it because it turns out Mrs. Giddings is actually running the whole operation, and she collects all the money, and she's keeping the money from Sarafina. She won't give her the money because if she gives the money to Sarafina, then she knows Sarafina's going to run off and start her own thing. So she's trying to hold all the strings. So that's when let's see what I was trying to talk about here. Mrs. Giddings, this is her house. She is Madam's sponsor. Suddenly everything made sense. That's why Mrs. Giddings went as every seance. That's why nobody knew anything about her. Sponsor, a nice word. Mrs. Giddings was really the brains behind the whole seance scam. They all worked for her. Frank nodded his understanding. How long has this been going on? Almost a year. Madam's talent were beginning to draw the attention of some important clients. Frank thought of Mrs. Felix Decker and starting to bring in a lot of money. Madam cares nothing for that, the professor insisted. She wishes only to help others. But Nicola was causing trouble. He wanted to leave with Sarafina. Mrs. Giddings didn't want him to leave. So they're all trying to point the finger at Nicola for the murder. By that point, Sarah arrives and talks to Frank. Then she does some interviews herself with Sarafina and her mother, and Sarafina confesses about Nicola. She also tells them about Mrs. Giddings owning the house and controlling all the money, and we get a little information about Nicola. Then Frank goes back and talks to the professor, and then after he claims that Mrs. Giddings was his employer. We also learn that there may have been a little romantic entanglement there. And Frank talks to Nicola, and they go to just not actually arrest him, but take him to the tombs. But Nicola runs away. And that just has everybody in creation pointing the finger at the kid. And they find the hidden room. They go into the seance room, and there's a little bit of a closet, and they go into the closet, and there's a false wall, and inside the false room is an old Victrola that plays baby cries and spirit sounds and wind sounds and all this stuff to con people with. The whole apparatus is in there. So that's why it sounds a little distancy, because it's behind the wall. People think it's from the other side. And then Sarah decides that Sarafina is going to come to her house to protect her from the newspaper people until they figure out what happened in the actual house. And Mrs. Ellsworth arrives, and Sarafina tells Mrs. Ellsworth where she can find her deceased husband's pocket watch. I will leave that little piece to the end of the book. You'll have to see if that comes true enough. So Frank, they discuss the case, and it seems the next day the professor calls Frank to the scene. Yes, ma'am. Come here. There's been a robbery. The safe has been cleaned out, and he proclaims that no one knew the combination to the safe. Well, if no one knew the combination to the safe, then how could there have been a robbery? But apparently there was a peephole that nobody knew about, and they watched the person who took the money watch the person do the dialing through the peephole across the room. So that's just a little extra spoiler. So they talk about they do some more investigating, and Malloy tells them about the green goods game. Yes, ma'am. Come here. Come here. Come here. Well, then stop. They call it the green goods game. What is it? It's a way to trick people out of their money. They send out letters all over the country offering to sell people counterfeit money. Is that legal? Mrs. Decker asked. Malloy's mouth quirked, but he managed not to smile. Not at all. But lots of people are curious enough to travel to New York to find out more about it. The operators pay all their travel expenses too, even if they decide not to buy in. So the suckers come to New York, and somebody, the one they call the streeter, meets them at the train and takes them to the hotel. Then the steerer takes them to meet the one they call the old gentleman, who is someone who looks very respectable. The old gentleman shows them a suitcase full of what they think is counterfeit money, except it's real money. Real money? Why would they show them real money? To convince them that it's quality, so they'll buy it. So how much does counterfeit money cost? 10 cents on the dollar. But the sucker is convinced. He pays for the money, and the operators lock it in the suitcase for him. Then the steerer escorts him right back to the train that will take him home and puts him on it. I don't understand, Sarafina said. How does that make any money if they sell real money for less than it's worth? Because when the sucker is distracted, the operators switch suitcases. When the sucker gets home and opens it, it's full of sawdust or blank pieces of paper or bricks or something. But they don't go back to New York and complain? This time Malloy couldn't help smiling. What would they say? They were trying to buy counterfeit money and someone cheated them? And so then there is a second murder, and so they decide that they're going to hold a fake seance, a reenactment of the crime. They get all the individuals, because some of the individuals are so desperate for Sarafina to contact their dead, deceased relatives, that they are willing to come back to the scene of the crime and go through it all over again. And they all come back to the table, and the murderer is revealed, and there's a little extra with Maeve, at the end a surprise little tidbit of MAEVE'S past that comes up also. And I enjoy uh, the author's notes. From here on out, the author's notes get more extensive, and I enjoyed the author's notes at the end of the book just as much as I enjoyed the book. So to find out who done it, you'll have to. I usually do not. That's the one thing I do not spoil is the actual who done it. But I will spoil the characters of the yin yang. But the uh, the Mrs. Ellsworth tells about the pocket watch. You'll have to. I'll leave that to you to read. I had a wonderful time researching seances for this book. I found lots of interesting information about how people do cold readings, which means how to make people think you know things about them when you really don't. What I learned is that most people are eager to help a self-professed psychic and will try to find meaning in anything that is said, no matter how vague or meaningless. This is called subjective validation, which is the process of validating words, initial statements, or signs are accurate because one is able to find them personally meaningful or significant. And Maeve uses a flashlight at the end of the book, and the first flashlight was developed in 1896. So it's a good one. So please check it out. Please hit the like and subscribe. Please check out my Star Trek recap episodes every single Friday. We are doing season 5 currently. If you have not watched any, please go back to season 1. I've recapped every single episode. And my If Then on Friday afternoons, if you like this author, then maybe you like that author. And Flashback Mondays, where we talk about all different authors from all different genres from my Romantic Times book review magazine. And of course, my daily book reviews. I'm trying to do Alex Cross. I'm having trouble getting some of the books. And we are doing J.R. Ward's Black Dagger Brotherhood. We are doing Victoria Thompson. And we are finishing up with Beatrice Small, Sky O'Malley saga. So those are the ones being done this month. And please hit the like and subscribe. Thank you.